Good morning, everyone. It's Friday, February 4th. It's 8:32 a.m. and this is the first half of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. Today, we're resuming our work on S-148, an act relating to environmental justice in Vermont. We've been looking at an evolving draft of the bill and have the Agency of Natural Resources in with us again to help us provide feedback on some of the current language, as well as proposals of amendment that Conservation Law Foundation offered on their behalf and others yesterday. So that I'd love to turn it over to you and hear your thoughts on and I think it would just be helpful if you'd let us know if you're referring to the red line from CLF or a prior version, so we're all working with the same draft. So with that, the floor is yours, Commissioner Walk and team.
Great. Thank you, Senator Bray. For the record, Peter Walk, Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. That is a really, you raise a salient point there with which version we're working off of. Our comments have been developed in response to the draft that you heard from Ledge Council, draft 1.1. However, we have tried to integrate the comments that you heard yesterday, the updated language you heard from Elena Mahaly yesterday, in terms of working through kind of where we think, sort of trying to integrate those responses. But it'd be helpful to clarify, I guess, at some point, sort of what your thoughts are in terms of how those various drafts will be integrated. Because of that, we don't have written language. We haven't shared written proposals of amendment, yet for you, because we don't want to confuse the matter, frankly, by having multiple forms of different words floating around there. So we don't have to answer this question now, but I do think it would be helpful to clarify where in the drafting process we are at some point.
Yes, well, I agree 101% with you. It's a little unusual to have the sort of staggered drafting thing that we have at the moment. So after your comments today, I'll take what I hear from you, plus what I heard from CLF, and sit down with Ledge Council and come up with a next composite draft to the degree that the comments are in line. If things are in disagreement, we'll leave them as in the current draft until we get an agreement. But I'll make sure that by the time we are back in on Tuesday, we have something that is the next draft of the bill. So we're, in short, where you and CLF and others are agreeing on language, then that'll be integrated into the bill, and things that are still left in discussion or dispute we'll stick with the draft 1.1 language until we have come to some sort of agreement. Okay.
Understood. That's very helpful. Thank you. I will also, there's a couple overarching points I would like to make before we get into the bill language itself. The first, as we've talked about to some extent is, but not sufficiently to this point is, and I heard this in, comments yesterday from both the witnesses and from committee members, was the idea of needing to have a discussion about the resources that are necessary in order to do this work. We've flagged that for you. However, we've really flagged it from a A&R sort of only perspective. There's activities expected from this from many different state agencies. And so I think this is the perfect opportunity, frankly, for a fiscal note on this bill, because of the various components and different involvement of different state agencies. We then work with JFO to kind of fill in those pieces. I think this is a good moment for that. The other piece that I would flag for you is that I know we had some discussions about this offline, Senator Bray, but they're currently named in this bill other state agencies that have yet to have the opportunity to appear before your committee. And I know you've got some of them appearing later on this morning, and there's interest certainly from the Agency of Transportation, I'm sure among others, to come in and speak to the bill, just so that you can understand the different perspectives amongst state agencies who are on, different have done different levels of effort on this work, and want to understand what your expectations are. So I would encourage that for sure. I think this is a broad sweeping bill that affects all of state government and really should be treated that way. And I presume it will get other stops along the way, but I certainly think as the sort of primary authors of this bill, it will certainly be helpful for, or excuse me, I shouldn't say primary authors, the primary sort of committee of jurisdiction here. I think there's a great opportunity to set the path well for this here in this committee. So with that, I'm happy to jump into specific comments.
Sure. Sorry, Commissioner Washington, since you can't see me, my shortest, clearest answer on those 2 points you raised is yes and yes. We will. So we will schedule it next. We have Department of Public Service coming in today. As you know, we couldn't get AOT in, but we will get the other departments and agencies in next week, and requesting from JFO to reach out to all the named agencies and departments to develop a fiscal note. So we're right on track with your thinking.
I also wanted to flag for the committee, there was some brief discussion yesterday about the agency's civil rights, environmental justice, and diversity and equity and inclusion coordinator, Carla Raimondi, who we funded the position in the FY22 budget, and have been looking for ways to increase the time available to her in the FY23 budget. That is a full-time position, and we're doing what we can to try to increase her hours in advance. It should be noted that Carla is primarily focused on civil rights at this moment. That's because that's where our greatest immediate need is. But the reality is, in order to do the work as outlined here, Carla's full-time status would be insufficient, and I think the obviously the fiscal note will help with that discussion.
Okay.
So I will
just so that just so that we get that. Since I've been asked this question a couple of times, what I heard was a hope on the part of some people supporting this bill that position in FY22 for the balance of the year would become a full-time position. And can you just speak briefly to that? I mean, it's not our job to deal with your staffing, but I just so that others who are inquiring about it will know that would be helpful.
We have already increased her hours, and we are looking for ways to increase those more. But it is in the FY22 budget, you provided us with the resources to have that be a part-time position, which we have proposed to increase to a full-time position in FY23. So if in the Budget Adjustment Act, the legislature determined that position should be a full-time position, then we could move that forward. But as of right now, the budget as passed is for a part-time position. So we've been working to figure out what flexibility we have to increase those hours, but there's certainly need and desire for that to occur.
So I will follow up with you offline to talk about what kind of additional financial support might be possible to be considered in BAA in order to do that. I don't want to take us off track. Okay.
That sounds perfect. All right. So let's talk. Let's get into the language. As per usual, I think Elena's comments on the findings yesterday were appreciated. I think there is some opportunity to provide the background and clarity on those. So I appreciate that. In the definitions section, so 6001, I did appreciate the change that was made in the first definition of cumulative environmental burdens in the proposed language around further definition by the Agency of Natural Resources. I do think that's sort of process wise a little bit of a challenge, and especially because there are certain components to the work that will follow that will need that definition. And I think the definition as it's laid out is sufficient. It is really the implementation of that, which is where the rules come into play, where the significant work will need to occur. I am going to move ahead to the meaningful participation definitions sub 7 in 6001, and say I think we appreciate the change that CLF reflected to strike the right, as that wasn't intended to be a legal right, as Ms. Mahaly mentioned. So appreciate that change. What was definition 8, the overburdened and underserved community, which had a challenging sort of process to it,
Yeah.
with sort of to be defined by us further. I think striking it doesn't necessarily resolve those challenges, and so I'm interested in whether there is a definition that could be put in its place, rather than have the agency define it, because it appears in many other places in the bill, and it impacts things like our report on where state funding is going. And if we have no definition of that prior to the report, I'm not exactly sure how we interpret that.
Right.
And it just is awkward. So, I think it either needs to be defined here, or it needs to be, all the references need to be struck. And that's obviously got its own challenges, given that, as we've talked about, the predictive ability of the environmental justice population definition is very helpful. And the wraparound piece of the overburdened and underserved gives us some specific kind of burden data to integrate with that process for our overall efforts. And so I don't want to lose that. I think it's awkward when it has no definition at this point.
Okay. Is that something that you and your colleagues are working on?
I think it's something that we can scour the existing literature and see if there is something that meets the need, but it is not something that we have at this moment.
Okay.
Moving ahead to section 6002, I'll flag, for example, the environmental justice policy, state policy in sub A refers to overburdened and underserved communities. And so that would be difficult to make sure that we're providing the attention that's requested in that, or that's directed in that last sentence, to understand where that should be directed. In sub B, I wanted to just sort of provide some grounding for the committee as to where, so that's the requirement of every state agency developing a community engagement plan.
Right.
And I wanted to
just for committee members who may be following in their bill. So you're on page 13, is that correct?
I'm on the end of page, well, yes, it's probably 13.
Okay.
Given that I've started to make, I'm in the Word version, and so we probably made some changes that may affect precisely where it is. But yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's no problem. I just wanted to make sure people knew where we were. Thank you.
Yes. And then so the Department of Environmental Conservation, as we've mentioned before, made the commitment to the environmental protection, working with the Environmental Protection Agency to develop a environmental justice policy and a community engagement plan or public engagement plan, that we in conversations with stakeholders determined that it was important that we slow down and listen first. That process has led to the creation of a community engagement pilot contract where we are going. We have engaged the Center for Whole Communities to do a really deep dive into issues that matter to three particular communities and understand the ways in which communication can be most effective with those communities. We anticipate getting a report back to that. That work will continue on throughout this calendar year, and we'll get a report back following that about things that we should think about as we're developing a statewide plan. So that plan, the development of that plan will come after the pilot project. And so the state of the DEC, which is probably one of the agencies our departments furthest ahead in this process, will really begin in earnest to work on that plan in starting, I think, Q2 of 2023. So that is just to take the work that we have done in with specific communities and then begin to see where there's consistent themes that we can bring statewide, where things need to be adjusted, what have you, and then bring it out to the public and talk to communities about it. And so that's why the July 1, 2024 date becomes challenging, right? This is important work for us to get done. And if we're just getting the important raw inputs to that conversation in sometime in early 2023, that's why it feels like 2 years out plus, but I just wanted to provide this sort of basic timeline. So as we think about what that definition, what that timeline is and how to make it meaningful, that's the sort of the reason why we described it in that way. So okay. I don't have a specific proposal for you in terms of when that should exist, but I will just note that if others in state government, other state agencies and departments are going to engage in similar processes, we've been at the development of that contract and the implementation of that contract for about a year now anyways. And so to do it meaningfully takes time. And I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of that. And that's something as well that the EPA flagged in their review, was to make sure that was one of the areas where we took the time to do it well and do it right.
Okay. Would it make sense to tease out in this section this deliverable, a community engagement plan for A&R, separate from the other agencies, and set your own timeline? And then given that you're further along and that other people are going to have to follow on, I'm guessing they're going to be learning from your experience. I don't know if you become sort of a template or leader, if we were to have the interagency council, if then, you end up playing a role of being the mentor to other agencies or something and departments.
Let me take that back and think about it. That's an interesting thought. I need to follow up with others and see if that is something that, on its surface, it certainly has some appeal, but let me dig into that a little bit more, if I may.
Okay, sure. Well, and it also doesn't seem practicable that if you're this far into it and this date is feels like it's too little time to do the work as well as you'd like, that others who haven't even started yet could possibly make such a date.
Correct. Yeah, that, I mean, that's probably the bigger concern in my mind, is just that, you know, for those agencies and departments that are, and they probably have, you know, everybody engages with the public in some way, but to do this in the way envisioned is a new paradigm and an important one. So let us think that through. I also wanted to, so we've been thinking a lot about the funding component, the 55% commitment of state funds. And I think there's a definitional piece and there's a process piece that sticks out in my mind as opportunities to improve the language that's currently in front of you. The first is a language piece, and this is something that borrows on from Washington State, is that that their funding, the goal, mind you, it's a goal, is to direct 40% of grants and expenditures that create environmental benefits to vulnerable populations and overburdened communities. That goal of environmental benefit investment, I think, is important, because there's lots of state spending that may or may not be of environmental benefit in nature, and just simply tracking state spending, I don't think is really what's desired. My recommendation would be that be part of the report that is asked for from state agencies, is to clarify what types of spending constitute environmental benefits. And the reason why, and that gives us the opportunity as well to align the work with the Justice 40 initiative too, which is really focused on environmental benefits. And so I think that gives us an opportunity. The process piece that I would mention is that, you know, we set the goal, and then we ask state agencies to figure out what current spending is. And that seems a little backwards to me. I would like to know what the baseline is before we jump into a clarified goal. So in thinking about this component, I wonder if it makes sense to kind of flip sub D and sub E, so that the report comes first and defines what, sort of how the state defined environmental benefit projects, and looked at in the last 3 years of spending, and then the sort of goal followed from there. And my recommendation is that it be defined prior to the report as a goal of 55%, and that there be an opportunity for the General Assembly to adjust that goal or to make it a requirement after the receipt of that report that defines kind of what business as usual looks like, if that makes sense. So that's just a sort of a process point that I think seems to make more sense to me in terms of defining what the current state looks like, and then making sure that we get to adjustments to that if it is inadequate presently.
Okay, thank you.
And I can we worked on some language to that effect, and can share some of those thoughts as we move forward.
Okay, great. And just more generally, I'm going to work on schedule to see if we can get everyone in committee at the same time next week on at least 2 occasions, so that we can do a real-time exchange of ideas and settle on some things. So thank you.
That sounds great. So then getting into section 6003, which I think is page 15, if my edits haven't changed the flow too much. I know that Ms. Mahaly represented that 18 months was a better timeline and a compromise with the Agency of Natural Resources for the establishment of what constitutes how we would apply a consideration of cumulative environmental burdens. But as I've probably remarked ad nauseum, this is one of the more challenging components to do well, to have it be meaningful for the communities, and to have it be clear to all Vermonters what the requirements are. And I believe that needs to take at least 2 years in order to better define it, to understand what that means, to come up with, to do reviews of the way others have approached it, to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches have been, and to understand the science behind it, and to figure out, not only because this has more than implications for the Agency of Natural Resources and our permitting review, it has significant implications for other state government entities as well. And so we'll need to make sure that we're not just focused on this from a sort of permitting and environmental funding perspective, that we're thinking about it kind of across the state of Vermont government enterprise, if that makes sense. So I think that this is another one of those things that to do it well takes time, and to do it, to short it that time has significant implications. And the other piece is that to have meaningful involvement, and I'll get into it in a moment with the Environmental Justice Advisory Council, should take time, right? Should get into that co-creation process. So that's my plug, and I will keep saying it and continue to say it ad nauseum, because it is, to me, the most important thing that we get right for the work that will come in terms of preventing undue cumulative burden on Vermont communities, and specifically environmental justice communities. So lots there, but willing to keep working it through.
Okay. And so, Commissioner, in the section right below, there's also another timed event, within 6 months of the environmental justice mapping tool. So
this to me is more of a question, Senator Bray. I'm not sure. To me, the mapping tool doesn't actually. It follows more how the cumulative environmental burden should be used, and they're interrelated, but there aren't really rules that are necessary for the implementation of the mapping tool, because the mapping tool provides the data that supports our cumulative environmental burden review, which is another reason to make sure that those two are aligned effectively in terms of their development and timeline. Because if we think about it from a mapping, where they're based on the current definition, there are maps of what environmental justice communities are, but to ensure that we have maps of where overburdened or underserved communities might be, and where cancer hotspots, or all of the sort of things that could play into that use, those are data points. The cumulative environmental burden rule would really define how that data was used, and the mapping tool is just a visual representation of it. So to me, that really isn't a separate rulemaking process from a process standpoint.
Right, and there's a section of the bill to come talking about thresholds and modifying thresholds, and I would think that would feed into the map. Is that not right? Am I thinking about that the right way? If you start adding new thresholds, then your maps will change. Maybe you're creating another layer for, as you mentioned, cancer hotspots or Superfund sites, or who knows what that additional layer is.
Right. Right. But those are the development of the mapping tool is just, is pulling together data sources to display them visually. If there are new pieces of data that we need to collect, that's kind of a different discussion. But that wasn't entirely your question, but again, that's another sort of factor as we think about where the gaps are. It may be that it's in the collection of data or the collection of data at a scale that is representable on the map in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to have more of a conversation about sub 2. I don't know if the thrust of that is to try to have the timely production of the maps, or to ensure that there's a rule that guides, their use by every agency, or both, or so maybe we can talk about that when we have everyone in the room next week.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. Thank you.
And then getting into the conversation around process in terms of rulemaking, you touched on this a little bit yesterday in terms of the proposal from CLF and the other stakeholders is that the advisory council provide their approval essentially at a supermajority level prior to the rules going to ICAR, the Interagency Council on Administrative Rules, which is prior to the public comment period. And so I'm trying to understand both how we as a state agency weigh public comment that follows interagency council, or the advisory council's approval, and also how what the expectation of the advisory council is in terms of what they've approved, because I think we're all in agreement that we should value public comment on a proposed rule and incorporate that feedback into that rule, right? So that is, part of the Administrative Procedures Act process that is an important part of the work that we do in a functioning democracy.
Right. Right. And we talked a little bit about this sort of double set of loops there. If there's a looping process within the advisory council until you get the supermajority vote that advances a rule to ICAR, and then it falls into the normal APA, and now you go out again and get public comments, then it does beg the question, well, does that advisory council have any further role, or have they've done their work, they've weighed in, and now the agency responds to public comments, which may not have come up during the prior process through the advisory council. So it's a little
correct. And I did want to offer the opportunity, Caitlin Ellerman from one of the agency's attorneys who's here has had significant involvement in the rule drafting process. And I was sure if you wanted to add anything to the conversation in terms of that interaction that we just discussed.
Sure. For the record, Caitlin Ellerman, attorney for the Agency of Natural Resources. Good morning. And I think Peter already sort of spelled it out. Is, one thing we want to make sure is that expectations are kind of grounded, and that there is a common understanding about what might happen the way this is currently drafted. And I also in my mind, since I was heavily involved in the Clean Water Service Delivery Act implementation, that that involved a large stakeholder process, and I can use that for some context and also kind of timeframes. So that the act passed in 2019. It was envisioned that it might be a year process, I believe. But it was a year process for stakeholder engagement that involved an advisory council, involved, public meetings, really scoping for basically a year to figure out, what do we need to build into a rule? And then from that point, close to a year, probably about 8 months or so, to draft a rule that encapsulated all of that work, all of that input. And then, once you finally have something that's appropriate to file with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rulemaking, you're looking at another maybe 4 months. So that took really 2 years. And we are definitely feeling confident and comfortable in what we file with ICAR. But that is, also just, the first step. And we're then, hearing what the interests are of other agencies. And we know that in this case, it's going to be really meaningful for each agency. And there could be some significant, sticking points or changes that are requested that we need to work through. And then, once we get something that is, we're comfortable to move forward with, we open, LCAR and establish the public hearing process, public comment process. And again, we hope that we've gotten a lot of that input already, but we also don't know what might come in at that point. So again, it's establishing expectations on, what might happen after that approval has occurred pre-ICAR, that there could be changes, significant input that would modify it. Also understanding that we're trying to, navigate, what is our authority? What have we been directed to do? How can we achieve this and, meaningfully respond to input? I understand that Attorney Stevens, who's also on the line from the Agency of Natural Resources, did take a look at the state of Massachusetts, which Ms. Mahaly had pointed to for this council vote approval process. I believe there it was actually a majority rather than a supermajority, which we haven't had a proposed definition of supermajority anyway. And I'm not sure if Attorney Stevens knows whether it's at what stage in the rulemaking, but that's sort of an overview. We want to make sure folks understand what can happen through the rulemaking process. Also, the responsibility that's on the agency to come up with something that achieves what we're being directed to do, while, certainly being as responsive as possible to input, and really like the reality of how long this takes through the steps. And hopefully, again, using the Clean Water Service Provider rulemaking as an example, the agency will gladly, stay in communication with the council and, utilizing the website and outreach to keep both the council and the public as a whole informed of what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve as we move along.
Can I ask a quick question? If you could refresh my memory, I'm not usually on LCAR, but I'm not involved in what the initial offering is so when you, at the first stage of rulemaking, do you draft a draft rule to circulate, and that's your part of your notice, and here's the initial draft, and that's what precipitates the first round of public comments. And then
Yes.
you come up with a second draft, and it's that second draft that then goes on to ICAR. Basically, maybe it's more than the second draft, but I mean, is that once you have a round of your own and it starts with a draft rule, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
After, and that's, it depends on the circumstances, but in this case, and again, similar to the clean water context, that, we do a pretty significant scoping process as well. I would envision something similar here. And then, yes, we start the rulemaking process with a proposed draft.
Okay.
And as we go through rulemaking, we have to provide, if it changes, certainly from the draft to final, each stage we're providing explanations of changes that were made to the original draft that was provided.
Okay. And then in the ICAR sort of cycle, then you're hearing from other agencies, and particularly, as you said, this rule in particular will have an impact on other agencies, maybe in a particularly profound way. So there could be a round of revisions then. Is that right? And okay, I'll pause. Yes. Okay. And then once you've settled with all the other agencies, and now you're ready to, I think, come to LCAR, is there a round of public comment between ICAR and LCAR? Or at that point, you're finished with public comment and you're just on your way to LCAR?
Actually, that is when the official public comment process occurs.
Okay, that's what I was getting myself confused about. So there's really two rounds.
Yeah, the official public comment, and I'm going to have to go back to my own notes. I think that the official public comment process is between ICAR and LCAR.
So if I could jump in here, Senator Bray, I think Caitlin's right. It's, that is when the official public comment process happens. We don't write rules in a vacuum, obviously. And so we want to make sure that we're taking in input as we go. I think the thing Caitlin mentioned that's really important is, using the Clean Water Service Provider rule development process as an example. That's what we aim to do, right? We want to work through potential challenges well in advance of it getting to the point where it's out in the public, because there's the expectation at that point, for better or worse, that this is kind of where we are, and people tend to sort of get concerned that that's the state of the rules, and that they don't, even though there is an official public comment process, that's where our direction is. And there are many steps along the way in the rulemaking process where we can make changes that have the same relative outcome and have different process steps, and understanding what the needs of various stakeholders are is very useful. So I guess what we're thinking about in terms of the rulemaking process and the sort of interaction with the advisory council is, as I briefly mentioned the last committee meeting we were here, is to do a sort of 3-step process. And this is sort of 3 formal steps, but it could be 3, it's really going to be an iterative process throughout. But a consultation, you can use different words for it, and whether we engage, whether we consult, what have you, with the advisory council prior to even beginning the sort of scoping process, right? To have a scoping discussion with them to understand what's part of the rulemaking process. And then to midway through kind of say, here are some concepts that we are thinking about. What do you think about these? What have we missed? What do we need to add? What do we need to change? What have you? And then bring the draft proposed rule to them for comment prior to ICAR, and to get their input on. That to me is taking what are some of the best practices that we've learned over the course of time in rule development and putting them down clearly into statute for the advisory council and how we would participate.
Is that something that you could, that process you're outlining, put into writing so that we'd have something to walk through first half of next week, please?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Can definitely do that. And so I think we still have some concern over the approval process that's outlined in the bill. I think it's if you're going to create an approval process for rules that is different than what's in the Administrative Procedures Act, I think that the Administrative Procedures Act should be amended rather than a creation of a sort of new process for one set of rulemaking. And for many reasons, part of it being the sort of expectation settings on how the council interacts. So I am, and some of the language that Ms. Mahaly provided yesterday in terms of access to the response to comment and to the comments that are received through the public process and the ability to sort of have an impact on those also sort of runs into sort of timing kind of conflict as we go through. Certainly the idea of providing the public comments as they're available to the advisory council makes sense. I don't have any concerns there. But we've got to do the official response to comments and develop those as part of the final record for the rule. So there's a lot of stuff there.
Well, as an appreciator of the APA, I know we need to honor the provisions of the APA. So we'll look forward to your creative proposal.
Thank you. And then moving along out of the rule making section into 6004, which is the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Interagency Council on Environmental Justice. One of the things that I would highly recommend, and this is Caitlin's idea and one in which I fully endorse, is that please change the names of one of those bodies, because they are far too similar and they're going to cause confusion. I would recommend something like the Interagency Committee on Environmental Justice, a la the ICCM, or the Environmental Justice State Agency Working Group, or something that distinguishes it from a council as the advisory council is. I just think it will provide some clarity and lack of confusion that is minor in nature, but will cause frustration. And as somebody who works for the Agency of Natural Resources that is often confused with the Natural Resources Board, I would very much appreciate that support.
Okay, I think that's probably a pretty good idea. Seen other agencies, the PSB and the Department of Public Service, seems like people used to get completely tangled up in that, and that they're less like, okay.
And then, so I heard mentioned yesterday that the proposal is now to increase the number of meetings for both bodies. Well, I think that is likely to be necessary to do the work that you've assigned. I also think it further highlights the comments we've made about the burden that this will place on members of the advisory council and the fact that they need to be appropriately compensated for their efforts. So I will leave that there. You've heard that. So I also wanted to note that I appreciated Ms. Mahaly's response to some of our comments around the work of the advisory council and the interagency group to look at the definition of an environmental justice population and to recommend to you, the General Assembly, potential changes. I believe she struck the sort of the factors that they should consider in their proposed language. I also wanted to flag that I think it's probably appropriate to strike some of the like prescriptive language in that review in the main body of 6004 C1A, with basically talking about sort of whether there are more inclusive thresholds and additional criteria that should be considered. To my mind, if we're asking them to review the definition and potentially develop alternatives or additions or modifications, that we should allow them to do that without restricting what that looks like. I think that's an appropriate reflection of the respect that you have for the advisory council and the interagency group. And we're happy to provide some language that would clarify that point.
Great, thank you.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I think one other nuance that we would ask you to consider is whether to add the term whether into the second line there. So whether the definition should be modified would be of interest, just making that open based on further consideration by the council and interagency group.
Thank you. Good catch. Yes. So it may be that those two bodies come together and agree that the definition is strong and good and should remain. And that is a recommendation that we should allow them to make.
And Ms. Ellerman, can you give me the line number for the weather? Just so I make sure I'm inserting in the right place.
Unfortunately, Peter, or Rachel, I don't know if you have the line.
So it's in the second line of the duties as prescribed in 6004 C1A, where it says within 1 year of the effective date of this act, consider and recommend to the General Assembly. It would be after that line where the definition should be amended kind of language would come in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that. The other piece that I wanted to mention, I think this is a kind of a growing pain issue, and I think we mentioned it the last time, but in later on in the section where it provides the duties of the advisory council, it talks about advising state agencies on environmental justice issues. And I believe it's 6004 C2 A. I think that is an important point and one that should be clarified, whether that is directly to those state agencies or in relationship with the advisory council, or excuse me, with the interagency group.
Yes.
Because I think it'll just be important to clarify that process, because it could overwhelm both state agencies and the advisory council and the interagency group if there is not clarity on what that is. So I could see if I'm a state agency reading this and say, oh, I'm supposed to, consult with the advisory council directly, and therefore I'm going to go, ask them questions, and it hasn't gone through the interagency group where that could have clarified and probably nipped some of those concerns in the bud, whatever. I think it just makes sense to clarify that should through consultation and meeting with the interagency group would be helpful there, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, that could be right, an all-consuming process for both the council and the departments, and I'm not seems point taken. I'm also not sure how every department interfaces with the council. Right?
Correct.
In what way do they take advice, and how do they use it? So, okay, thank you.
And then I wanted to reflect appreciation again for CLF's proposed edits around the Title VI complaints and the annual review of those complaints. I think we need to, I haven't had a chance to dig into the language that's been proposed in great detail yet, just to make sure that it covers all potential issues. But I think that movement towards an annualized review and a discussion of the broader issues is important, rather than a reflection of every individual complaint, which was where our concern lie. So let us review that, and we will come back to you and say yay or nay, or yay with a little bit of change, or what have you. So we will return there. One point that I wanted to flag, 2 points again, the resources for the advisory council in terms of both support from the Agency of Natural Resources and their direct support for the significant work they will be doing on behalf of the state needs to be appropriately considered as this work has gone through, and I think should be part of the fiscal note and would be part of what we would evaluate in terms of what we think is necessary in order to implement this bill. So I wanted to just, as you're thinking through what that fiscal note looks like, that request looks like, I would highlight those two areas.
Mr. Commissioner, is there a model at ANR for, you are all just are still, but particularly heavily involved in the last year in the development of the climate action plan. Was there a stipend pool to fund not only attendance at meetings, but the outside of meeting work required in order to be prepared to to participate meaningfully in meetings?
No, and that is, I think there was a discussion of that during the last legislative session, but it did not lead to change.
Okay. I'm just wondering if we have a model anywhere already that we can look at, or this is new territory.
I am not aware of one, but JFO might have better information than I do, because I don't work in every area of state government, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
And then one of the sort of key points in terms of what the advisory, setting up clear expectations for the advisory council and their authority, there's a component of sub 7 down towards the bottom of 6004. I'm sorry, I've sort of lost where I am. I think which subsection I'm in my scrolling in my laptop in the car. But there's a note that says this: the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources shall implement recommendations of the Advisory Council to the extent they are consistent with this chapter. I think it's important to note that there are going to be recommendations that are made and that are likely to be supported by the Agency of Natural Resources, provided we have the existing legal authority and resources in order to be able to do them. And so to create the expectation that we're simply going to follow through on recommendations without some acknowledgement that we might not be able to seems like we're going to set up the council for the expectations that may not lead to reality. And I don't want to do that. So we can provide some language that would sort of caveat that in a way that creates clear expectations, but doesn't, makes clear that the Agency of Natural Resources will be interested in those recommendations and implementing them to the extent feasible, but the feasibility piece is important.
Okay.
And then finally, just to sort of anchor a bit on our discussion of the environmental justice mapping tool, as we just mentioned, I think that the January 1, 2024 date for the mapping tool is probably sufficient. But again, that mapping tool is going to provide a lot of the input to the way in which we factor in the efforts to develop the rule about cumulative impacts. And so if that information isn't solid until January 1 of 2024, would be very difficult to have a rule that was promulgated at the essentially the same time as it's currently proposed in the draft you heard yesterday from Ms. Mahaly.
Okay.
So
quick question on that. Are you proposing moving up the date at all on the mapping process, or leaving that where it is and then pushing out the rulemaking process till you've had enough time to complete the mapping rule?
Yeah, as we proposed 2 years, or I mentioned the idea of 2 years after the date of this passage, or we could simply put it as, July 1, 2024, I think would be, it would provide some more clarity as to what the date is. I never really liked the 2 years after passage, because it becomes really difficult to keep track of, especially when it's in the green books rather than in statute.
Right. It is we don't usually set clocks that way. I agree. Okay.
And that is the extent of our comments to this, sort of major comments at this point. Obviously, we want to get into the words in lots of different places and work on them with you. But those are the sort of major items that we wanted to continue to keep on your radar, along with what you may hear from other state agencies, and then the work that you've requested to begin discussion around the fiscal note. So I'm going to be quiet now.
Okay. Thank you. So Ms. Ellerman or Ms. Stevens, do you have anything more you would like to share this morning?
No, thank you, Senator Bray.
Okay. Well, so Commissioner Walk can't see it, but here's my copy of the bill. So work with council to advance some of these edits into a next clean draft, and then we can all work on a single composite version. So thank you very much for coming in and helping us get a closer read on the language under development. And with that, we're actually following up on one of the recommendations that the commissioner made, and we're going to be hearing from in the next week. Every operating area that's named in the bill, we'll invite them to committee. And the first guest who's coming in is Mr. Poor and Ms. McElhenney from the Department of Public Service. So good morning to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks.
Chair, if I may, just before you even start, I was, as you know, with the pro tem this morning, and I arrived late. Can you just update me just briefly on the position that we've been talking about?
Sure.
Just so I know.
Yes. So we discussed that position. So basically, the short of it is that I'm going to be talking with Senator Kitchell about the possibility of providing more resource to the agency in FY22, so that the position which was funded last year by the legislature as part-time could be advanced to full-time, because we certainly have a lot of work to do, but the legislature chose not to fund it at full-time level last year. So it's possible through BAA that could be considered, and Senator Westman's on appropriations, so I see him ready to go.
I heard this slightly different from you.
Okay.
What I heard from the commissioner say is it's a half-time position. You need the position first in language moved to a full-time position. And then what I heard was the amount of resources, because this is a gearing up in the position. So the question is, I didn't hear a dollar amount about what they need to get to finish this budget year, but the first thing we have to do is in language, move it from a half-time position to a full-time position. And then there may be but he did say internally within the budget, they're trying to put more resources to it. And I didn't know what that meant. But we need language that says it's a full-time position, not a half-time.
Okay, so Ms. Ellerman is still here. And if you could, I'm not sure if the commissioner has signed off, but if you could pass that request for language back onto him, because it's language plus money, not just money. Okay. And we
Sure,
will
Senator,
follow up.
I will do that.
Okay, thank you. And Senator Westman, thanks for helping us get it right.
Actually, I think what and I would say to you is I think what we're going to do is pass the budget adjustment over today
Right.
on the floor and wait till Tuesday. So that means that if we wanted to support that language to go to full time, that would create a difference between the House and the Senate anyways. That gets us in it, but it would be we're not gonna put the full amount of a half-time position in A&R's budget for all of 22. So are we talking about a month? Are we talking 2 months?
Right.
So what are we talking about for funding?
Okay, so for the meeting that I'm trying to schedule with Senator Kitchell, I'll ask A&R to come back with basically sort of the prorated expense to move someone to full-time for some portion of FY22 and the language that would go with that. And then we will meet with the Propes and see if there's an opportunity to include that in Budget Adjustment Act, which as Senator Kitchell said late yesterday will passed over, so we have an extra work day. But it would be great if language, if this is something you could develop today, that would be good because that bill will be up on Tuesday.
Senators, if you could let me know how that should be passed to you, that would be helpful.
Sure, if you just email me and Jude, we'll make sure we get it to the right parties. And actually, please also include Senator Westman on that email.
Would you mind including me as well? That would be great. I know this is something that I've heard from multiple people about.
Okay.
Thanks. And then Senator Bray, may I, so thanks, Senator Westman. I appreciate that. So I see that some of this will be done in budget adjustment and then possibly pick up the full-time position in the non-prorated way in the big bill. Okay,
Right.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification.
Right. It's my understanding that for FY23, it was intended to be a full-time position already. It was just a question of the balance of this fiscal year. Okay, so with that, thank you, Mr. Poor and Ms. McElvaney for standing by while we do a little housekeeping, but you know how it goes. When bills are moving, you have to keep up with them. So with that, welcome to the committee again. Thanks for coming back in. You all have been involved in environmental justice works, concerns, implementation in your own operating area. If you could share with us a little bit about what you're up to and how S148 has an impact on the department.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having us. For the record, TJ Poor, Director of Planning at the department. And we asked to testify early on in this bill to cover just a couple of areas. We're generally following agency and natural resources lead in specifics with the bill, and we'll coordinate with them going forward. But wanted to provide a little context related to the Comprehensive Energy Plan and how it addresses equity and environmental justice, and then speak specifically to the department's roles in the energy policy space and the relationship between the PUC and the department, and give an initial take on resources. So starting with the context, I want to introduce Claire McElvaney. She's the Senior Energy Policy Analyst, Senior Policy and Planning Analyst at the department. Sorry, Claire. And She really took the lead on the equity chapter in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which is really the first substantive chapter in the plan, and it staffed the Just Transitions Committee of the Climate Council, so has been really engaged in this space. And I want to turn it over to Claire to just give a little context and remind folks what was in the energy plan in this space.
Thanks, TJ. And yeah, again, for the record, Claire McElveny, Senior Energy Policy and Program Analyst. I don't know who came up with that title, but it's always a mouthful. And yeah, as TJ mentioned, I've been leading the department's work in this area for much of the last year, both through the Comprehensive Energy Plan and participating as a staff support member for the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And so Chapter 3 of the Comprehensive Energy Plan really lays the foundation and discusses how the department plans to achieve the CEP goals in a just and equitable manner. And both sort of lays a foundation for how these issues are treated within the Comprehensive Energy Plan itself, and then also provides some recommendations for the department's work going forward through policies and implementation. The chapter really relies heavily on the work of the Just Transition Subcommittee of the Climate Council and the guiding principles and tools that they had developed, both to help ensure consistency between the Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and also just recognizing that those tools were really developed with a variety of diverse voices from Vermont's communities. So relying on them to sort of provide a lens for this work moving forward. So the conclusion of the chapter provides quite a few high-level recommendations for how the department intends to continue this work moving forward, sort of recommending that the department develop a strategy for how to support a transition to a just and equitable energy system moving forward, that equity be considered a core decision-making criteria in the energy policy statutes within Vermont, including, for example, 30 VSA, 202A, 218C, 248, and others. The CEP lists several others, suggesting that the department should complete a review of existing policies and practices for engaging with the public, and recommending changes for how to advance more inclusive and transparent engagement where possible. Thinking about how our programs and policies could be designed to collect data required to do analyses to understand how benefits and burdens are being distributed by their implementation, and a couple others. But we largely believe that these recommendations that the CEP makes are pretty well aligned conceptually with what's in S148, which TJ will talk a little bit more about specifics, but ultimately sees the bill as providing, as I think the witness from CLF mentioned yesterday, a more concrete framework to guide the department's work in this area, providing more tools and deadlines even for how we might advance this work. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to answer any more specific questions about what's in the CEP, but just wanted to tee up a little bit of context. And,
well, thanks for that. So I noticed one of the recommendations is for the Act 174 energy planning work. Do you feel like, given your work in the last year on in the comprehensive energy plan, that you say, oh, well, we might re-envision how we do those, or it's a subtle modification to the process you already have? Which, I mean, I've gone to PUC-led hearings or department-led hearings, sorry, and the broad public has been invited. That sometimes there's a pretty large crowd, but what kinds of, are you thinking about revamping those based on the work that comes out of S148?
That's a good question. I think, the Act 174 standards themselves are intended to flow from state policy. So we definitely need to consider what is required to be consistent with that. The updated standards do seek to address equity more explicitly, and we're actually entering the process of updating guidance for how to advance that work. So I guess the answer to your question is we're definitely beginning that work and thinking about what it will entail moving forward, and happy to keep the committee updated as we move forward on that.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Poor, so I don't know if at this point, if you, I don't want to interrupt other testimony you've prepared, so let me pause and just wait. I did just want to flag, or if we could come back briefly to funding, noting that we'll have a more formal process through JFO to reach out to your area so that we can collate the data from all the operating areas that are proposed to be affected by S148.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll touch a little bit on that, but there'll be more to come for sure. So one of the reasons we reached out this week was the draft bill didn't address the Public Utility Commission at all. And I think you've taken some testimony and are on a path to probably address that, but we wanted to just give a little more context on the department's roles in the regulatory space, and then as an advocate, as the ratepayer advocate, and then as in our state energy office role, and how those two hats kind of move forward and maybe reflected here. So on the former, as a ratepayer advocate, we advocate on behalf of ratepayers before the Public Utility Commission, and a lot of times that actually is entails really trying to represent and bring kind of especially low income issues to light. I think historically we've done a really good job on an income basis and advocating on behalf of ratepayers. But of course, that's my opinion. But I think the broader equity and environmental justice, I think we're all just kind of, as an agency, we're learning and improving as we go here, as is the whole state and everybody. But in that advocacy before the Public Utility Commission, we're not the decision maker, and so that really authority, a lot of times, most of the time, really lies with the Public Utility Commission. And we recommend that the commission actually be added to the list of agencies implicated through the bill. And when you think about that, they really make energy and climate related decisions through in a couple of ways, through its orders, like through tariff decisions and how low income or other demographics may be treated. How the efficiency budgets, for example, are structured. That is done through a Public Utility Commission order, where there's a certain amount of spending required geographically and income based. They also implement it through rules, like the Renewable Energy Standard rules. First ordered. That was first by order, but then adopted by rule. And so those kind of set the framework for programs that are actually implemented, particularly for regulated entities. So those electric and gas utilities, the efficiency utilities, and then other entities that are trying to site projects, infrastructure projects, they're the ones that are actually developing the programs. So as you think about kind of the reach of this bill and how you want it to affect programs, I think it's really important to consider the PUC is kind of setting that framework so that the programs that kind of fall under their jurisdiction are actually following along here. Because otherwise, the department actually has a very limited amount of dollars that go for programs, and but we do have an advocacy role and a strong advocacy role, and then the commission decides, but those other entities are the ones that are actually implementing the programs. So I wanted to give that context, and to be clear, we're not recommending that we be removed from the list of implicated agencies. We think it's appropriate for us to be on there, but just the addition of the PUC as well.
But you'd probably be in trouble with the PUC if you recommended adding them and removing yourself.
Yeah, I did give them a heads up yesterday that we were gonna say this, but so you should probably talk with them to see how they feel about it and ask them to come in
Yes.
as well, and see if they agree with my characterization. But it really seems like that they do set that framework and set the structures. If you think about the res, you think about a potential clean heat standard and how entities are operating within those programs. The other area where we're active is acting as the state energy office. So officially what that means is that under the federal Department of Energy's state energy program, we're the Vermont interface. And so through that interface, we receive a small amount of money through a federal formula. It has ranged over the years from $200,000 a year to $350,000. So it's a small amount, but about half of that goes to staff working on innovative programs like expanding the state energy management program. When we had the Clean Energy Finance Collaborative a few years ago, support for the development of our building energy codes, and then to hire, the other portion of it goes to things like hiring consultants to help us on some of those programs, like building energy codes is probably the biggest one, where we every 3 years update those standards in both the residential and commercial sectors. But also there's other support that we provide, like to Drive Electric Vermont, although we've scaled that down over time as they've been built, but we were one of the early funders of Drive Electric Vermont. Back years ago, we funded the Vermont Energy Education Program through this, which then Efficiency Vermont ultimately took over some of the funding once it was established. The School Energy Management Program, we have our Thermal Information Clearinghouse that's on our website that was funded. So these are just a range of things that we do with this kind of this portion of the department, and I just wanted that to be in mind as you think about some of the requirements in the bill, which I think are well intentioned. So I don't want to pull away from them, but I don't want to. It could be really difficult, one, to track or to show, prove out that these types of funds, you can almost think of them as R&D or innovative program development type funds. That these types of funds have met a certain metric, right? Because they're trying to prop up programs that will be statewide and have their own design parameters within the program. And so I just wanted to put that out there so you're thinking about that. I know other state agencies will have similar R&D type programs as well, but just to be sure we're cognizant of that and how we set the requirements to not kind of limit some of those things that is like seed money for programs that we need to move the ball that might not have impact in year 1, but in year 7 it could really lead to market transformation.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on resources, and I know Natural Resources, Agency of Natural Resources raised this quite a bit, and you've started to, well, you said you're going to bring everybody in to talk about this, and I just wanted to mention it for the department's part as well, is that to effectively carry this work out, that and it's probably true for every agency, that additional resources are going to be necessary. I don't have specific numbers for the committee now, but I could imagine it being the equivalent of actually having a full-time staff person dedicated to this, making sure it's equities incorporated into all our advocacy, creating community engagement plans, and then certain efforts like the comprehensive energy plan really, it would probably need additional resources. This past year we were able to partner with the Agency of Natural Resources and the Climate Council on their engagement efforts, which, I frankly, it was a two-way street for sure. We were able to coordinate and collaborate with a lot of technical experts and host that kind of part of the engagement. But the actual public engagement and drawing people in, which Climate Council, and we all recognize, still fell short, but we really relied on that and wouldn't have had the resources to do it, even at the level that was done, without the Climate Council. So specific efforts, and specific efforts like the energy plan, or like big initiatives or programs that we're rolling out, additional resources probably be necessary as well. And that's really all we came prepared to talk about today. Happy to talk more about the department and what we do, or anything else you want to talk about.
Okay. Well, I think that's, a good first check-in on this bill, since we haven't had a conversation with you about it yet. And the one thing that's a little tricky is we don't have a finished bill, so it's not like you can read through and say, oh, now we see clearly what kind of obligations we are entailed in all this. But I think the general shape of the bill, it's enough for us to all get started in the conversation, knowing that it will evolve. And even as it passes the Senate, then it's got to get to the House, and there'll be further conversations there. But so with that, thank you. We will, you'll hear from Joint Fiscal as part of a formal fiscal note process. And if we have other questions, we'll certainly get back to you. And the other thing too, on your side, of course, if as you see the bill evolve, if there's things that come to mind that you think we should be aware of, please let me know, and we will schedule time again. So
we will do. Thank you for having us in today.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, so committee, we're going to pivot to S234, our work on Act 250. And one of the things that's come up repeatedly during our conversations is, to what degree can we facilitate the enhanced rate of developing housing by using the priority housing projects? And I think we've all heard about them. We know there's an affordability component, et cetera, but there's some complexity in terms of what they are, how they operate, what the requirements are, where they can be located, and then how they're treated or not treated in Act 250. So we're asking for sort of a priority housing project 101. And so we have two teachers in the room with us this morning. Good morning, Chair Haskell and Ms. Stone. Thanks for coming back.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'd say you have a teacher in the room and her sidekick.
Okay.
And we're ready to help answer questions and all of that. I did update our spreadsheet for you with all 9 districts, if there was any interest in going through that.
And the project spreadsheet that we looked at briefly before.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could send that over to Jude, we'll post it and make sure it's distributed to everyone on the committee.
Great.
I don't know if we'll have time to get to it today, but thank you for adding information.
So all 9 districts are in there. And just overall, then I'll let you ask questions probably of the legalities with Allison, but there have been 22 PHPs in the districts that we looked statewide, and they all fell within Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle, and one in District 7, which is the Northeast Kingdom, Orleans, Essex, and Caledonia counties.
Okay. All right. So I don't know how you want to proceed. Do you have you or Ms. Stone want to sort of explain what they are, what constitutes a priority housing project, that sort of primer on it?
Yeah. I'm going to cede the floor to Allison.
Okay.
So I guess I would point you first to the definition of a priority housing project, which is in 10 VSA 600135. it's defined as a discrete project located on a single tract or multiple contiguous tracts of land that consists exclusively of either A, mixed income housing or mixed use, or any combination thereof, and is entirely located within a designated downtown development district, designated new town center, designated growth center, or designated village center that's also a designated neighborhood under a separate statutory provision, 24 VSA Chapter 76A, or a mixed income housing mixed income housing that's located entirely within a designated Vermont neighborhood or designated neighborhood development area under the same chapter, 24 VSA 76A. And then under Act 250, under our definitions section, there's a definition of development in 10 VSA 6001 relating to the construction of housing projects. And where the priority housing project piece comes in is that it's certain priority housing projects are exempt or do not constitute development under Act 250 if they meet certain based on the number of housing units proposed and the population of the municipality in which the priority housing project is to be located. And so I don't know if you want to get into the details of that, but a priority housing project constitutes development under Act 250 only if the number of housing projects is 75 or more in a municipality with a population of 6,000 or more, but less than 10,000, or 50 or more in a municipality of a population with 3,000 or more, but less than 6,000. So pretty factually specific, or 25 or more in a municipality with a population of less than 3,000. So I think, and then there's some other, pieces of the statute that I don't know that they're necessarily pertinent for our discussion here, but there's some, the statute addresses historic preservation and how that might play into it if there's a potential impact to historic places. I think I'll take a pause there. So that's the basic framework that we're operating within under the current statutory.
And can you say a little bit about the affordable housing component and the mixed use component? Because I think they're not all allowed in, or all requirements to qualify in every type of designated area. Is that correct?
So
what I'm trying to ask is, so for instance, you're developing housing and there's an affordable housing percentage that's required in order to have it qualify for a PHP, as well as being in the right kind of designated area. There's also the mixed use requirement, but it seems so that I'm just remembering that they don't quite align, and I think that's maybe because they have a different sort of intent. So can you just spell out for the committee when it is that mixed use is allowed versus when it's affordable housing is the qualifying feature?
I think that would come back to so I'm looking at the definition in 35 and 60135.
Chair Bray, would you ask that question? Do you mind asking that question again?
Sure. And we have our counsel with us as well. So the feature, the nature of what makes something affordable housing, a housing project includes some combination of either mixed use or affordable housing, right? And what I was just trying to make sure that we understand, because we're thinking about trying to facilitate the development of priority housing projects. That's I think sort of the route where that seems to be where the most energy is in terms of how to move forward at this point in terms of achieving the housing goals. So I want to make sure we understand sort of all the adjustments or all the qualifications you need to meet or can make on this law in terms of what will constitute a priority housing project.
So just to cut through, so the question is, what constitutes a priority housing project?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And in what types of locations?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Ellen, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add on this, but it is sort of I don't know if I have a good answer on the spot here, but because it cross-references to some other statutory provisions under Title 24. So I can take a look at those and follow up, but.
Well, maybe Ms. Schakowsky can help us some, basically I'm thinking about, we're trying to design a bill. We're trying to know what outcomes we will see. So if you're talking about a downtown, for instance, versus a neighborhood development area, does a downtown qualify if it just has affordable housing, or can it also have mixed use? How about a neighborhood development area? Affordable housing, or can it also have mixed use and that kind of thing?
Who are you posing that question to?
Well,
anybody can answer.
To either of you that feels like, oh yes, I can tell you something more about that.
So I think you're alluding to the fact that you have a bill in your committee that is proposing to condense the current definition. So the current definition of priority housing project is layered, and it incorporates multiple other defined terms, which is why this gets a little tricky. So first, there is a distinction based on where the project is going to be located. So currently in neighborhood development areas, to be a priority housing project, it has to be mixed income housing. For the other designations, downtown, new town center, and growth center, and a village center with an NDA, you have the ability to be a mixed income housing project or a mixed use project, which allows for commercial space in addition to the housing.
Okay.
So there is that distinction currently, and there are a lot of defined terms in this defined term. So we can go through each one slowly if that would be helpful, but that is condensing this definition to just say that mixed use or mixed income. There is a bill S270 that is suggesting that you condense that to just say priority housing project is for those projects located in a designated area that's either mixed income or mixed use. So I think you were just trying to highlight that currently right now, NDAs can only be made up of housing, income, not the mixed use projects.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is kind of for the second day in a row, like the Matryoshka doll thing, where there's something inside something else that refers to the other piece, and you have to get them all apart to see what's happening. Okay, and in Ms. Haskell, back to the data you've pulled together. So I think you were saying there's 22 PHPs. Did you have a chance to even sort of ballpark what percentage of new housing built was in the form of PHPs versus non-PHPs?
Well, I can tell you that in the years that we looked at, 2017 to 2021, there were 22 PHPs, and there were 65 projects that required Act 250 permits. So it's about a third. Is that, am I answering your question correct? That's what you were asking?
Okay, well, so for the 2/3 that weren't PHPs, were they housing or they're just all other projects?
We looked at multi-unit housing and senior housing. We did not include, I'm not going to use the right terminology, but we did not include multi-unit in subdivisions. Is that how it's, I'm not saying it right, but
The terms the coordinator used for the projects do not include typical suburban development projects that could include duplex or triplex buildings.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I was just trying to have a ballpark sense of how crucial, in conversations in the last several weeks, PHPs have been represented to the committee as a particularly valuable tool. And so I'm just trying to have a better understanding about housing developed over that last 4 years, how much of it actually comes in the form of PHPs versus non-PHPs.
Yeah. And so it's about a third, as I just said, but it's also interesting to note that it's the 22 are in three districts, overwhelmingly in Chittenden, several in Franklin Grand Isle, and one in the NEK.
Okay, right. All right, and I don't know if you want. Thank you for that. That's very helpful, and it's good to as we look at the different proposals, we'll want to revisit any adjustments to language with you in detail, like send you a draft, and then and go through it with you in terms of your thoughts on it, the practicability of it, is it something you can sometimes we will think of things in the legislature that turn out to be very difficult for the NRB to implement, and we just want to avoid doing that. I guess that's the simple way to say it.
Thanks. Yep, I get that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Senator Westman.
So you mentioned briefly in passing in this that some were low income, some were elderly housing, or do we know what categories these housing projects were? How many of these were housing for older Vermonters?
How many of the 65 projects?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have that handy, but I certainly will. I can count them up when we're off and send that information to you.
I only bring that
It's
up.
a handful.
Okay.
It's not a ton.
Okay. I only bring that up because I think I said this before into the committee. In my community there, in the communities right around me, there's a lot of backup for older Vermonters that don't want to leave their community. But as soon as there's an opportunity to downsize, they also free that house up for a middle-class family to move in. Yep. So and I don't know if we've ever really paid attention to that issue to the level I think.
I will get some information back to you on that. And I mean, anecdotally, I know that there are long waiting lists for like Cathedral Square type of places in Chittenden County, 1 or 2 years long. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, like Senator Westman, it's been a lament of mine. We've talked about it, but I'm not sure that we've made appreciable progress. It's not this committee that would be doing it necessarily, but so many small towns I've lived in, if you become elderly and maybe can't quite manage a full house, but want to stay in the community you grew up in, maintain your friendships, all the rest. Around here, you often have to move like down to Middlebury or something like that. And so it's like a sad state of affairs. I guess I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a reluctance to move out of the community you've lived in your whole life.
Yeah, sure. Certainly very understandably. And friends are important to everyone, but it's my understanding that especially as people age, one of the ways of staying healthy as you age is keeping your friendships and staying active. So, all right. Well, Senator McDonald.
Just to share in your community, when someone does move down to Middlebury, for the reasons that have been mentioned, who's likely to buy the dwelling that's been vacated?
I don't think I can really, I don't think I can give you an accurate answer. You know, I mean, it seems like it varies. Sometimes someone in that person's, a child of the person who vacates moves in, so it stays in the same family. Other times it's just sold entirely. New families come in. Sometimes someone leaves and it becomes a rental property.
Do we actually have the numbers on that? You know, I think of the person bailing the boat, and they're bailing as fast as they can, but the hole in which the water is rushing is letting more water in than you're bailing out. When properties go for sale, we've had testimony in the committee we serve on in the afternoon, Mr. Chair, where properties are being, testimony is that properties are being bought by people from out of state, and that they're not, they go off the market of homes or affordable homes for Vermonters. So is that, are we keeping up with that or not?
Yeah, I good question. I certainly don't know the answer to that. Right. So
Thank you.
Ms. Haskell and Ms. Stone, thanks for coming in. Just it's a brief visit, but we just wanted to check our facts a little bit on priority housing projects.
Yep, happy to help, and I've already forwarded the spreadsheet to you all, Simon, to Jude.
Okay.
So thank you.
And as we develop our bill, we'll send you an next draft as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. And I, if I might add, I regret that I wasn't able to be more helpful in talking through some of the law around the PHPs, but because they're exempt, we don't interface with them a lot. But certainly some of it, and my understanding from the district coordinators is that there's not a lot of dispute over whether something is a PHP. So, but they do have so the district coordinators, you know, do deal with that to some extent. So if there's anything I can do as a follow-up, and if I can provide anything to follow up in terms of clarification that I could write up, happy to do that. But
okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, I think one thing we'll be asking you about looking ahead to a next draft is we've talked about if we were to find a way to do support more housing through PHPs, for instance, in response to the sort of ARPA spending timeline pressures, if we were to do that for a limited period of time, basically to wrap around the ARPA funds moving through. Mm-hmm. So you might do something, change the law for a period of 5 years, mm-hmm. and then do some reporting. I think one of the things we're starting to think about is how would we assess the impacts of having made that change? You know, like, a certain way you could call it an experiment. We don't know what business as usual would deliver versus what a modified set of rules around Act 250 and housing would develop. But I think the question we have is there a way to monitor what happens and then assess whether what the impacts are, good, bad, and different? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much. Ms. Chakowski, I don't know if you have anything more on priority housing projects that you think we ought to hear about while we're talking about it right now, but if not,
sure.
Okay.
Sure, I did have Jude post on your website today the NRB's priority housing project flowchart, which is a really good visualization on how you can see the different levels of the definitions in the priority housing project. So reading the statute can be a little bit confusing, but they have a really nice chart showing how you can assess whether a construction project is going to potentially be qualified for the exemption as being a priority housing project.
Okay, so let me pause and ask the committee. I've walked through that with you. I found it very helpful to see sort of how the decisions flow one from another. Are members of the committee interested in seeing that? If so, is that something you can?
I think that would be helpful.
Okay, if you can.
We should schedule that.
Right. Well, it's on our schedule right now, as a matter of fact. But let's see about, can you?
Actually, a break is on our schedule right now. Some of us
Yes,
schedule
well, there is
ourselves around.
there is that. Yeah.
All right, good for you, Senator McCormick.
All right. So we are going to resume at 10:30. So let's move that to 10:35, just so we don't have any distress. And when we come back, Mr. Chakowski, if we can go through that flow chart.